The morning of February 1st, 1944, broke cold and gray over the English countryside. At an airfield in East Anglia, crews of the U.S. 8th Air Force were already awake long before dawn. Engines rumbled, coffee steamed in metal cups, and men spoke quietly, their words short and heavy with routine. Inside the barracks of the 379th Bomb Group, the men of Heaven Sent, a B-17 flying fortress, sat around a wooden table. The smell of oil and tobacco hung in the air. Captain Jack Thompson, their pilot, looked down at the mission briefing sheet in front of him. His eyes traced the route from England across the Channel, deep into Germany. Today's target, Leipzig. Fact, heavy defenses. Expected flak. High risk. High risk. Jack took a slow breath. He had flown 19 missions. This would be number 20, and each one felt harder than the last. Same route, same hell, said his co-pilot, Lieutenant William McGee, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. Jack didn't answer. He just nodded and folded the briefing paper into his jacket. Sergeant Leo Parker, the bombardier, adjusted his goggles and grinned. Let's hope the Krauts are still sleeping when we get there. Nobody laughed. At 600 hours, the crew walked out toward the shimmering silver silhouette of their plane. Heaven Sent. The nose art showed a pin-up girl with angel wings. Beneath her, in bold red letters, were the words, "Deliver us." Jack ran his hand along the cold metal of the fuselage. He always did that before a mission, a quiet ritual, a silent prayer. Inside the cockpit, the world narrowed to switches, dials, and the soft hum of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines. Tower, this is Heaven Sent, requesting clearance for takeoff. Copy that, Heaven Sent. You are go for takeoff. Godspeed, boys. The engines roared. The ground trembled. And then, with a rush of wind, the flying fortress lifted into the dull morning sky. As they climbed through the low clouds, England disappeared beneath them, fields and rivers swallowed by mist. Ahead lay the endless gray ocean, and, beyond that, enemy territory. Jack looked out the window at the other bombers in formation, dozens of them, stretching out like a flock of silver birds. He always felt safer in the formation, strength in numbers. But he also knew the truth. Once they crossed into Germany, the sky would turn into a graveyard again. Formation looks good, McGee said, scanning the horizon. Roger that, Jack replied. His voice was calm, but his hands were tight on the yoke. In the radio compartment, Sergeant Frank Delaney adjusted the frequency, his headphones crackling with static. Command says flak expected near Bremen, then heavy resistance over Leipzig. Jack nodded. Figures. For the next hour, they flew through silence, only the steady drone of engines and the faint chatter on the intercom. Each man sat with his own thoughts. Some prayed, some smoked, some stared blankly into the clouds, lost in the endless white. At 900 hours, the coast of France appeared below, dark green fields and small villages dotted with smoke from distant fires. They had entered enemy airspace. Keep your eyes open, Jack said. The waist gunners moved to their positions. The tail gunner, Private Tom Harris, loaded his twin 50 caliber machine guns and scanned the sky behind them. Looks clear so far, he said. It always looked clear until it wasn't. At 10 to 12 a.m., the formation crossed into German airspace. The sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off the silver wings of more than 100 flying fortresses. They looked peaceful from a distance, slow, graceful giants gliding through the blue, but everyone inside knew what waited ahead. Flak zone coming up, said Delaney over the intercom. Jack adjusted his oxygen mask and tightened his grip on the controls. The sky was eerily calm, too calm. Then, suddenly, black puffs exploded in the air around them. Boom, boom, boom. The entire plane shook as bursts of flak tore through the formation. Flak, 12 o'clock high, shouted the navigator. Shards of metal ripped through the fuselage, the deafening sound filling every corner of the aircraft. Hold her steady, McGee yelled. Jack fought the yoke as turbulence from the explosions rocked the plane violently. A nearby B-17 caught a direct hit. One wing snapped, sending the aircraft spiraling toward the earth, trailing fire. Jesus, muttered Leo from the nose turret. They didn't stand a chance. The air smelled like smoke and fear. Inside Heaven Sent, the men clung to their positions, praying the next burst wouldn't be theirs. For minutes, the storm raged. Then, as quickly as it started, the flak stopped. The black clouds drifted away behind them. Flak zone cleared, Delaney reported, breathing hard. Jack nodded but said nothing. He knew the silence never lasted long. 5 minutes later, the radio crackled again, a voice shouting through static. Bandits! Fighters at 2 o'clock! Repeat! Enemy fighters inbound. Jack's blood ran cold. He looked up. Out of the sun, small black dots appeared, fast-moving, growing larger with every second. German Messerschmitt Bf-109s. They're coming, yelled Tom from the tail. Tracer rounds streaked across the formation like red lightning. Engines roared, and the calm sky turned into a battlefield. "Gunners, open fire!" Jack ordered. The waist guns rattled to life. The top turret swung around, spitting streams of lead into the approaching fighters. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat! The air filled with the clatter of 50 caliber fire and the scream of diving planes. A Messerschmitt zipped past their nose, guns blazing. Bullets tore through the windshield, shattering glass. McGee ducked. Close one. Jack didn't flinch. He kept the plane level, eyes locked on the horizon. Another German fighter came in low from below. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Eddie Cole, saw it first. "I've got him! Firing!" The turret spun, twin barrels flashing. The fighter exploded midair, a ball of orange fire spiraling downward. "Nice shot, Eddie," someone shouted. But there was no time to celebrate. Another wave of fighters came from the rear, firing relentlessly. A B-17 to their left took several hits. Its left wing burst into flames. Jack watched helplessly as the plane lost altitude. Tiny figures, parachutes, opened one by one as the crew bailed out. Moments later, the burning bomber exploded in a cloud of smoke and debris. "Stay tight in formation," Jack shouted. "Don't break off." But the chaos was overwhelming. Fighters weaved between bombers, guns flashing. The air was a storm of metal and fire. Jack's engine screamed under the strain. The left engine was coughing, losing power. "Number two's hit," McGee called out. Jack checked his gauges. The temperature was climbing fast. "Feather it! Shut it down!" The propellers slowed to a stop. They were now flying on 3 engines. But they were still in the air, and Jack was determined to keep it that way. For 20 endless minutes, the dogfight raged. Then at last, the enemy fighters began to retreat. Fuel low, ammunition nearly gone. The German pilots peeled off, disappearing into the distant haze. Silence returned, broken only by the hum of the remaining engines. The crew exhaled as one. The battle was over, for now. Jack wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Everyone okay?" he asked. "Minor damage, but we're still flying," McGee replied. Leo's voice came through, shaky but alive. "Bombs are still armed. We're good to drop." Jack nodded. They weren't out of danger yet. The target, Leipzig, was still ahead, and so was the worst part of the mission. By 11:30 a.m., the formation approached Leipzig. Below them stretched a patchwork of fields, factories, and smoke. Anti-aircraft guns were already firing, bursts of black flak filling the sky like deadly confetti. Every man in Heaven Sent knew this was the moment that decided whether they would live or die. "Bomb bay doors open," Leo called from the nose. "Roger that," Jack replied. The roar of the engines deepened as the plane leveled out at bombing altitude. The formation tightened. The sky was thick with B-17s, dozens of them, wings almost touching, all heading toward the same target. It was like watching an iron wave roll through the air. Flak bursts grew closer. A shell exploded beneath their right wing, throwing the aircraft upward. "Steady!" Jack shouted, forcing the plane back under control. The altimeter spun crazily for a moment, then steadied. "Bombs away!" Leo called. A deep thud echoed through the fuselage as the payload dropped. Below, dozens of other bombers released their loads in perfect unison. From above, it looked like a silver rain falling toward the earth. But then, disaster struck. "Jack, look above us!" McGee shouted suddenly. Jack glanced up through the cockpit glass. His stomach dropped. A B-17 from another squadron, 10 horsepower, was directly above them. In the chaos of battle, it had drifted off course, flying too low, and before anyone could react, a burst of flak struck it dead center. The explosion ripped through 10 horsepower's belly. Flames poured out of the fuselage. The entire aircraft lurched downward, spinning, straight toward Heaven Sent. "Pull up! Pull up!" McGee screamed. Jack yanked the controls, but it was too late. A deafening crash split the sky. Metal shrieked. Engines tore apart. The 2 massive bombers slammed together in midair, one falling onto the other, wings locking with fuselages grinding. Inside Heaven Sent, chaos erupted. Men were thrown against walls, instruments shattered, alarms blared. Smoke and fire filled the cockpit. Jack hit his head against the control panel, dazed but conscious. McGee was bleeding from his forehead, shouting through the noise. "They're stuck to us! The other plane's on top of us!" Jack looked up through the shattered cockpit window and froze. Through the haze of smoke, he could see the bottom half of 10 horsepower crushed into their fuselage. Its landing gear was wedged into their wing root. The 2 planes were fused. "Jesus Christ," Jack whispered. For a few seconds, everything seemed to slow down. Both planes, mangled, broken, should have fallen out of the sky, but somehow they didn't. They were still flying. Smoke trailed behind them, one engine dead, the others howling under the strain. The combined weight of both aircraft was enormous. It made no sense that they were still airborne. Inside 10 horsepower, chaos turned to horror. Half the crew was gone. Those still alive were trying desperately to escape the burning wreck. Through the jagged hole in the floor, one of the surviving crewmen looked down and saw the faces of heaven-sent pilots staring back up at him through the broken glass. "Dear God," he whispered. Jack's intercom was dead. Smoke filled the cockpit. He struggled to see through the cracks in the windshield. "McGee, what the hell's keeping us in the air?" McGee shook his head, staring upward in disbelief. "Maybe their wings are holding us steady." The smell of burning fuel filled the cabin. Eddie, the ball turret gunner, yelled from below, "Captain, we're on fire, but we're not falling." Jack forced himself to focus. "Check for survivors up top. If anyone's alive, they need to bail." The top turret gunner climbed through the emergency hatch, peering at the twisted wreck above them. He shouted down, "There's movement. I see one guy." Then, through the flames, a figure appeared. A man in a burned flight suit, waving weakly. The impossible was happening. Two B-17s, both mortally wounded, were somehow locked together and still flying as one. The pilots of nearby bombers couldn't believe what they were seeing. Radio chatter exploded across the frequency. "Holy hell, there's two fortresses stuck together. They're still in the air. My God, they're piggybacked." The sight was unlike anything anyone had seen in the war. Two four-engine bombers torn apart, flying like a single dying beast across the German sky. The sky was chaos. Black smoke, burning planes, and explosions everywhere. And in the middle of that hell, Heaven Sent and 10 horsepower were locked together like some mechanical nightmare, two dying birds refusing to fall. Jack gripped the controls, his hands trembling. Every movement of the yoke felt heavy, sluggish. The plane was fighting him, like it wanted to go down, but something was still keeping them in the air. "McGee, what's our altitude?" 6,000 feet and dropping, but slowly. Jack glanced at the gauges. Most were shattered or dead. Only one engine on the right side was still responding properly. The others sputtered, choking on smoke and oil. Behind him, chaos reigned. Leo was tending to the wounded bombardier. Sparks rained from the ceiling as the radio operator tried to get a signal out. The ball turret gunner had escaped just before the turret jammed shut. It was now crushed under debris. "Jack, we gotta bail," McGee shouted. Jack's jaw clenched. "Not yet. If this thing's flying, we're not done." Above them, the burning remains of 10 horsepower groaned and creaked. Metal was melting, rivets popping loose. From one of the open gun ports, a surviving airman from the upper bomber was still visible, waving desperately. "Help me," he screamed. But there was no way up, no ladder, no path, just twisted wreckage and open sky. Jack yelled, "Tell him to jump! That's his only chance!" But the man hesitated, terrified. Seconds later, a burst of fire swallowed the top half of the wreck, and when the smoke cleared, the man was gone. McGee lowered his head. Jack said nothing, just stared forward, eyes fixed, jaw tight. They were over enemy territory. Below, the fields of Saxony stretched endlessly. German troops on the ground were pointing upward, watching in shock as two B-17s, mangled together, drifted through the clouds. From another bomber flying nearby, a gunner filmed the sight with his camera. The footage would later become one of the most haunting images of World War II. Inside Heaven Sent, the men worked like machines. They sealed holes with whatever they could find. They fought fires with blankets and extinguishers. Some prayed, some just stared into space, numb. Leo finally managed to get the radio working, his voice shaking. "Mayday, mayday. This is Heaven Sent. We've collided with another fortress. We're still airborne, but badly damaged. Requesting heading for friendly airspace." Static. Then, a faint voice. "Heaven Sent, this is command. Repeat your position. Did you say you're flying piggyback?" Jack grabbed the mic. "That's affirmative. Two fortresses, one above the other, still flying." The controller on the other end didn't reply for several seconds, then quietly said, "God help you, boys. Turn west. If you can make it across the Rhine, we'll guide you home." Jack took a deep breath. He tightened his grip on the controls. "All right, hold together, baby." Just a little longer. The crew followed his lead. Every man in that aircraft knew the odds were impossible, but somehow they believed him. Jack's calm voice, his refusal to give up, kept them moving. For another 20 minutes, they flew. Through smoke, through gunfire, through a sky that looked like hell itself. Each minute felt like an hour. Each sound, a potential death sentence. Then suddenly, another explosion. The left wing of 10 horsepower tore loose, spinning away into the clouds. The shock jolted Heaven Sent violently. Jack barely kept control. "We're losing her," McGee shouted. "Not yet," Jack barked. The two planes dipped, losing altitude fast. Below them, forests, rivers, and distant mountains. The Rhine wasn't far. If they could just hold a little longer. "Everyone brace," Jack yelled. The controls were stiff. like pulling on stone. His arms burned, his vision blurred. But still, he refused to let go. For the next few minutes, the men of Heaven Sent lived between life and death, flying a monster of twisted metal that should have fallen 1,000 times over. Somehow, miraculously, they were still in the air. The horizon shimmered with smoke and sunlight. Jack's eyes burned, his throat raw from the fumes. Every breath inside Heaven Sent tasted like burning oil and fear. "Altitude," he shouted. McGee's voice came back, barely audible over the roar. 3,000 feet, dropping fast! The Rhine River stretched out below them, a silver ribbon cutting through blackened earth. On the far side lay friendly airspace, safety, home, survival. But they were still deep inside hell. The wreck above groaned louder, twisting with every gust. Pieces of metal fell away like dead leaves, spinning toward the ground. The two bombers had become one, a monstrous shape limping through the sky. Leo crawled forward from the back, his face black with soot. "Radio's dead again," he coughed. Jack didn't look away from the horizon. "Then we'll make it without one." Below, tracer fire shot up from German flak batteries. Explosions burst around them, shaking what was left of the airframe. One shell ripped through the tail, tearing away more fabric and metal. The plane shuddered, tilted dangerously, then righted itself. McGee's voice cracked. "Jack, we can't take another hit." Jack's reply was cold and steady. "Then we won't." He guided the crippled fortress with both hands, feeling every vibration through the yoke. The control cables screamed, the wings bent, but something, some invisible thread of willpower, kept them flying. Inside, the men worked in silence. The engineer monitored the last surviving engine, praying it would hold. The gunners, their weapons useless now, just stared at the river below. Nobody dared to speak of what might happen next. Jack's mind raced. If they could just cross the Rhine, maybe they could crash land in a field. Maybe someone would find them before the wreck burned out. Maybe. Then came another sound. A low, metallic groan. The connection between the two planes was breaking apart. The top bomber, 10 horsepower, was sliding backward, its nose dipping. Jack yelled, "Brace! She's coming loose!" The upper fuselage tore away, shearing off in slow motion. Flames erupted as the second bomber peeled off and dropped like a dying bird, crashing into the forest below with a thunderous explosion. The shockwaves slammed through Heaven Sent. The controls jerked violently. Jack fought to keep the nose up. The airspeed was falling fast. "Hold on," he screamed. "Hold on, damn it!" The plane lurched again, losing altitude rapidly. The Rhine loomed below, cold, wide, merciless. Jack's vision blurred. For a split second, he thought of home, of his father's farm in Kansas, of his mother's smile, of the quiet life he'd left behind. McGee's hand gripped his shoulder. "We're not going to make it, Jack." Jack turned his head, eyes bloodshot but fierce. "Yes, we are." He pulled hard, both arms shaking. "Yes," and the plane leveled out just enough to clear the riverbank. The fortress skimmed the water, so close that its reflection flashed beneath them. Spray hit the glass like rain. They'd crossed. They'd actually crossed the Rhine. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then the crew erupted in cheers. Hoarse, weak, but real. Leo cried out, "We made it, Jack. We're over friendly lines." But Jack didn't smile. He knew what came next. The engines were dead. The plane was gliding, bleeding altitude fast. There would be no landing gear, no runway, only fields and luck. "Everyone prepare for crash landing," Jack shouted. "Strap in. Keep your heads down." McGee gritted his teeth. "Where are we putting her down?" Jack's eyes locked on a stretch of open farmland ahead. There. The earth rushed up to meet them. He cut what little power was left, lifted the nose slightly, and the plane slammed into the ground with a deafening roar. Metal screamed. Wings snapped, dust and debris filled the air. The impact tore through the fuselage, throwing men against the walls. Then, silence. The fortress lay broken, burning in a field, but incredibly she was down in one piece. Smoke poured from the engines, flames licking the wings, inside groans and coughing. Then a voice, Leo's, shouting, "Everyone out! Move!" The surviving crew crawled out of the wreck, dragging the wounded. They stumbled across the field, collapsing in the grass, watching their beloved B-17 burn behind them. Jack was the last to climb out. He turned back, staring at the wreck that had somehow carried them through hell. The tail number still visible, Heaven Sent. He whispered softly, "You really were." The morning light broke across the smoking wreck. The once proud bomber, Heaven Sent, now lay shattered in a German field, its wings twisted and scorched. Crows circled overhead. The only sounds were crackling fire and the soft moans of the wounded. Jack sat in the dirt, his flight jacket torn, blood on his temple. He could barely hear anything over the ringing in his ears. For a moment he thought he was dead, but then he saw McGee limping toward him, covered in dust, holding his shoulder. "You okay, Captain?" Jack blinked, then nodded slowly, still breathing. They turned to see the rest of the crew gathering near the broken tail section. Leo was helping the radio operator, whose leg was badly burned. The gunner, barely conscious, kept whispering, "Did we make it?" Jack answered, his voice hoarse but steady. "Yeah, we made it." Smoke still rose from the fuselage. The top half of 10 horsepower, the second bomber, was gone, reduced to scattered wreckage miles behind them. Nobody knew if anyone from that crew had survived. Jack looked around. Open fields, a few farmhouses, no sign of enemy soldiers yet. They were deep behind enemy lines, but luck had carried them far enough west that Allied patrols might find them soon. McGee pointed toward the sky. "Look!" In the distance, the faint roar of engines. 2 Allied fighters appeared, circling low. They'd seen the smoke. Moments later, a British air rescue team was radioed in. For the first time since the collision, Jack allowed himself to breathe. He sat down in the dirt, staring at his trembling hands. Hours later, they were pulled from the crash site by Allied ground forces. A British jeep arrived first, followed by a group of medics. The soldiers were stunned. They'd never seen anything like it. One of them, a young lieutenant, walked up to Jack and looked at the wreck. 2 fortresses? Locked together? You flew that across the Rhine? Jack nodded slowly. The lieutenant shook his head in disbelief. Bloody miracle, sir. The crew were taken to a nearby field hospital. They were alive, but haunted. Even as doctors tended to their wounds, their minds stayed in that sky, back in the burning clouds where death had been inches away for hours. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again. The collision, the flames, the man screaming for help from the upper bomber the moment the planes tore apart. He sat on the edge of his cot, staring into the dark. Leo was beside him, bandaged and exhausted. "Can't stop seeing it, huh?" he said quietly. Jack shook his head. "Feels like we brought ghosts back with us." The next morning, they were debriefed by senior officers. A colonel entered the tent, holding a notepad. "Captain Andrews, your crew's survival is frankly impossible. Command wants a full report." Jack explained everything. The hit, the collision, how the planes fused together, how they somehow stayed airborne. The colonel took notes silently, occasionally shaking his head. When Jack finished, there was a long pause. Then the colonel said softly, "Do you realize what you accomplished, son? No one's ever seen anything like it." Jack didn't answer. He just stared at his hands. "It was an accomplishment, sir. It was survival." In the days that followed, photos and reports of the incident spread through the Allied bases. Crews started calling it the piggyback miracle. Some said it was proof that fate itself had carried heaven sent home. Others called it divine intervention. But Jack didn't like those words. He knew what it really was, a mix of luck, skill, and something he couldn't quite name. A few weeks later, he visited the graves of those who hadn't made it, the men from 10 horsepower and the few from his own crew who died in the crash. He stood in silence, the wind rustling through the grass. Leo joined him. "Think anyone will believe it really happened?" Jack smiled faintly. "They'll see the pictures, they'll read the reports, but they'll never feel it like we did." He looked up at the sky, calm, blue, peaceful. "The sky looks different now," he said quietly. Leo nodded. "Yeah, feels like it remembers." Back in England, word of the piggyback B-17s spread like wildfire. Photographs and eyewitness accounts poured in from other bomber crews who had seen it happen. The intelligence officers could hardly believe it. 2 flying fortresses, fused together in midair, flying for over 40 minutes before going down. At the base, a special investigation team was formed. Engineers, flight analysts, and senior officers gathered around diagrams of the B-17. They wanted answers. How could 2 aircraft collide so violently and still stay airborne? Jack and his crew were summoned to briefing after briefing. Each time they retold the same story, how Heaven Sent had collided mid-formation, how the top bomber had become lodged above them, how control remained possible. One engineer, a man named Reynolds, listened intently. "So you're telling me," he said slowly, "that both sets of wings were damaged, yet you still had enough lift to cross the Rhine?" Jack nodded. "The upper bomber's fuselage blocked most of the left wing, but somehow it balanced us out." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, muttering, "That shouldn't be possible." The investigation continued for weeks. Recovered wreckage was brought in from the crash site, twisted sections of fuselage, burnt engines, and fragments of both aircraft. The evidence told the same unbelievable story. Somehow, against every law of physics, the 2 planes had locked together in a way that created temporary stability. It wasn't flight, it was controlled falling, but it was enough. Reports were written, stamped, and classified. The final document concluded, due to the structural interlock between the 2 aircraft, airflow distribution across remaining wing surfaces allowed limited lift, making continued flight briefly sustainable. But those were just words. For the men who'd lived it, the truth was far stranger. Weeks later, Jack was invited to speak at an officers' meeting in Cambridge. They wanted him to tell the story firsthand, not as a report, but as an experience. He stood before a room full of officers, engineers, and pilots. His uniform was clean, but his eyes were tired. "When you're up there," he began, "you think you understand the sky. You think you can predict it, control it. But the truth is, sometimes the sky decides what happens. We didn't fly that day. It carried us." The room was silent. Some of the men looked skeptical, others deeply moved. When he finished, one general approached him. "Captain Andrews, men like you remind us why this war has to end. Nobody should have to go through what you did." Jack simply nodded. "Yes, sir." In the months that followed, the surviving crew of Heaven Sent were reassigned to training and advisory duties. None of them ever flew combat again. Some returned home before the war's end. Others stayed, helping train new crews who would fly the next wave of missions. But Jack wasn't ready to leave yet. He spent his evenings walking the airfield, staring at the rows of new B-17s waiting for takeoff. Each time he saw one lift off, his chest tightened. He couldn't help but imagine two of them colliding again. That sickening crunch of metal, the fire, the helpless fall. Leo once found him sitting by a hangar late at night, staring at the sky. "Still thinking about it?" he asked. Jack gave a faint smile. "Every day." Leo sat beside him. "You know, people call it a miracle. I think it was something else." Jack looked over. "What's that?" Leo shrugged. "Proof that some things can't be explained, only survived." Jack didn't answer. He just kept looking at the stars. The same stars they'd flown under that terrible day. They looked calm, distant, eternal. When the official report finally reached Washington, it caused a stir among Air Force engineers. The phrase interlocked stability became a strange topic of study. Some argued that the combined airframes had created a crude form of aerodynamic balance, a piggyback lift. Others dismissed it as coincidence, pure luck. But among pilots, it became legend. A whispered story told in mess halls and barracks, the day two fortresses became one and refused to die. And somewhere in those stories, the names of Heaven Sent and 10 horsepower were remembered, symbols of courage, tragedy, and impossible survival. By the time 1944 came to a close, the skies over Europe had changed. The Allies were winning. The missions were fewer. And Jack Andrews, the man who had flown a broken bomber across enemy skies, finally received orders to return home. He didn't argue. He simply saluted, packed his things back, and walked to the transport plane that would take him back to America. As he boarded, he turned one last time to look at the field, the same kind of field where Heaven Sent had once burned. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "Time to go home." The ship rolled gently against the waves as it crossed the Atlantic. The war in Europe was nearly over. For the first time in years, Jack Andrews wasn't listening to the sound of engines or gunfire, only the sea. He stood alone on the deck, coat collar turned up against the wind. Every breath of salt air felt strange, peaceful, almost unreal. Behind him, other soldiers laughed, smoked, or played cards. But Jack just stared at the horizon, quiet, thoughtful. He'd survived the impossible. Yet, somehow, survival didn't feel like victory. When he finally stepped off the transport in New York Harbor, the city erupted in celebration. Crowds lined the streets, waving flags, cheering for returning heroes. Jack moved through it all like a ghost, shaking hands, smiling faintly, but feeling miles away. Reporters had already heard of the piggyback B-17. One ran up to him, camera flashing. "Captain Andrews, is it true? 2 bombers flew as one?" Jack gave a tired smile. "It's true," he said softly, "for a while." The headlines the next day read, "Pilot survives impossible midair collision, a miracle in the skies." But to Jack, it didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like a debt, a second life he hadn't earned. He returned to his hometown in Kansas that summer. The air smelled of wheat and rain. His parents stood waiting at the station, tears in their eyes. His mother hugged him so tightly he could barely breathe. His father, a quiet man, just shook his hand and said, "Welcome home, son." Jack smiled. Good to be back. For weeks, he tried to settle back into normal life. He helped on the farm. He fixed fences. He walked through the fields at dawn, listening to the sound of the wind through the grass. But the war didn't leave him. At night, he woke up, drenched in sweat, hearing the roar of engines, the creak of metal, the screams. He'd sit on the porch until sunrise, cigarette glowing in the dark. One evening, his father joined him. "You still flying up there?" he asked quietly. Jack nodded. Every night, his father looked out across the dark fields. "Well, son, maybe that's the price of coming back." Months passed. Jack was invited to speak at veterans events, but he always refused. He didn't want to be called a hero. He didn't want applause. He just wanted peace. Leo visited once, years later. He'd found work as a flight instructor in California. They sat together on the porch, sharing a bottle of whiskey. Leo laughed softly. Can you believe it's been years? Sometimes I wonder if it even happened. Jack smirked. It happened. I've got the scars to prove it. They sat in silence for a long while. Then Leo said, You know, people still talk about heaven sent. They say it was luck. Jack looked at the stars. Maybe it was. Or maybe the sky just wasn't ready to take us. By 1945, the war was finally over. Japan had surrendered. The world was tired, but free. Jack read the headlines in the newspaper, and for the first time in years, he felt something like relief. He looked out over the Kansas horizon, the same one he dreamed about during every mission. It was still there, quiet, endless, untouched. And for the first time, it felt like home again. He walked out into the fields one morning and stopped, looking up at the sky. It was blue, clear, perfect. No contrails, no bombers, just peace. He smiled to himself. Fly safe, boys, he whispered to the men who never came home, to 10 horsepower to heaven sent. The wind carried his words away. Years later, long after the echoes of war had faded, the story of heaven sent refused to die. It lived on, whispered in hangars, told in classrooms, written in the margins of history books. Students of aviation called it the miracle of the skies. Engineers called it impossible. But the men who had lived through it, Jack Andrews and Leo Carter, called it simply luck. In 1947, the Air Force invited Jack to a ceremony in Washington. They were unveiling a memorial to the crews of the 8th Air Force, the men who'd fought and died over Europe. Jack stood among rows of uniforms and medals, the sunlight reflecting off polished brass. A general took the stage and said, Among the countless acts of courage in this war, one stands out as a testament to the indomitable spirit of our airmen. When two B-17s collided over enemy skies, and one carried the other home, it proved that even in the face of destruction, the human will to survive can perform miracles. Applause filled the hall, but Jack didn't smile. He just looked down at the small medal in his hand, engraved with 2 wings touching. He didn't see glory in it. He saw faces, his crew, the ones who hadn't made it. After the ceremony, Leo found him standing alone outside. You should be proud, Leo said. Jack shook his head. I'm just grateful. Proud doesn't feel right. Leo nodded quietly. Yeah, me too. In the following years, Heaven Sent became a symbol in training manuals and morale posters. Artists painted it, authors romanticized it. But the truth was simpler and harder. It wasn't just a miracle. It was a moment born of chaos, fear, and instinct. A testament not to perfection, but to persistence. Jack once told a young reporter, if you fly long enough, you learn something important. Sometimes survival isn't about skill or luck. It's about refusing to give up when everything around you is falling apart. In the 1950s, Jack became a commercial pilot. He loved the quiet hum of civilian aircraft, so different from the growl of wartime engines. Every takeoff, every landing felt like redemption. Sometimes passengers would recognize his name. Captain Andrews, the heaven-sent pilot? Jack would smile politely. Yes, ma'am. That was a long time ago. He never told them what it really felt like. The terror, the silence, the moment he thought he was already dead. He kept that part locked away like a secret between him and the sky. By the time he retired, the world had changed. Jets had replaced bombers. Wars were fought on screens instead of skies. But still, every now and then a young cadet or historian would send him a letter. They'd write things like, Your story inspired me to fly, or I want to be as brave as you were that day. Jack always wrote back the same thing. Bravery isn't about what you do in the air. It's about what you live with after you land. In 1972, Jack visited a museum in Dayton, Ohio. There, hanging from the ceiling, was a restored B-17, painted in shining silver, its nose art reading, Heaven Sent. He stood beneath it for a long time. Tourists passed by, pointing, taking pictures, reading the plaque that told the story in clean, simple words. But Jack knew what the words couldn't capture. The smell of smoke, the fear, the miracle. A young boy standing nearby looked up at him and asked, Sir, did you know the pilot? Jack smiled faintly. Yeah, kid, he said softly. I knew him. As he walked out of the museum, the sun hit his face just right, warm, golden, alive. He looked up at the sky one last time. There were clouds drifting slowly, peacefully. And for a moment, he could almost see it again, 2 planes locked together, burning across the heavens, refusing to fall. He whispered, Still flying, huh? Then he smiled and kept walking. The years slipped quietly into decades. Jack Andrews grew old. The lines on his face etched deeper with time, each one a reminder of a story lived, a friend lost, a sky survived. He no longer flew planes, but every morning he would walk to the edge of his small-town airfield and watch the clouds move across the horizon. Sometimes if the wind was just right, he could almost hear the low hum of the old B-17 engines, like ghosts still patrolling the sky. In 1983, a filmmaker from the BBC visited Jack's home. He was producing a documentary about forgotten heroes of World War II. He asked if Jack would appear on camera to tell, in his own words, what really happened that day over Europe. Jack hesitated at first. He'd told the story too many times in his head, but never aloud, not completely. After a moment, he nodded. The interview was filmed in his living room. A small American flag sat folded on a shelf behind him. When the cameras rolled, Jack began to speak slowly, his voice steady, his eyes distant. It wasn't about bravery, he said. It was about holding on, about refusing to let go even when everything told you it was over. People call it a miracle. Maybe it was, but I think it was just men doing what men had to do. He paused, looking down at his hands. They say 2 B-17s flew home as one. I say 2 crews refused to fall. The interviewer sat in silence. There was no need for another question. That moment, quiet, raw, honest, would later become one of the most powerful scenes in the documentary. Millions would see it. And for the first time in years, Jack felt peace. A few months later, Leo Carter visited him again. They sat together on Jack's porch, the same way they used to sit under the wing of Heaven Sent after missions, just talking, saying nothing that needed to be said. You ever think about what happened up there? Leo asked. Jack smiled faintly. Every day, but not with fear anymore. More like gratitude. Leo nodded. Guess we got lucky, huh? Jack looked up at the sunset. Luck's part of it, but I think the sky just wasn't ready to let us go. They both laughed. A soft, tired laugh, the kind only old soldiers understand. In 1985, Jack passed away quietly in his sleep. He was 71. At his funeral, veterans from across the country came to pay their respects. A folded flag rested on his coffin, and the sound of a single trumpet echoed through the cemetery. As the last note faded, a formation of vintage planes flew overhead. The lead aircraft, a shining B-17, dipped its wings in salute. The pilot, a young Air Force officer, had grown up watching the documentary. To him, Jack Andrews wasn't just a name. He was the reason he learned to fly. Years later, the story of Heaven Sent was preserved in museums across the United States and Europe. Photos of the 2 bombers, one lodged atop the other, still somehow airborne, hung beside the words, "When 2 B-17s became one." Visitors would stop and stare, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some called it divine intervention. Others said it was physics and luck. But everyone agreed it was one of the most extraordinary survival stories of the entire war. Today, deep in an air museum in Duxford, England, there's a small plaque near the tail of a restored B-17. It reads, "Dedicated to the crews of Heaven Sent and Lady Jane, 2 planes that refused to fall, 2 crews that refused to die." Beneath the plaque lies a single photograph, Jack Andrews and Leo Carter, standing side by side in 1944, smiling despite the chaos behind them, both with that same look in their eyes, a mixture of fear, pride, and quiet strength. And if you ever stand there, if you ever look up at the silver belly of that bomber glinting under the museum lights, you might feel it too, that strange pull between earth and sky. A reminder that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just 2 broken wings holding together long enough to make it home. And somewhere above the clouds, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of those old engines, still flying, still free. The end when 2 B-17s piggybacked, the miracle in the skies,